Wiehahn, thanks for joining us. We're really glad to have you with us. To all our listeners, please remember to subscribe and follow us on LinkedIn for the latest news and updates. As many know, our content is geared towards enabling climate change players to scale, and we touch on themes around people, brand, and systems. This week, I'm super chuffed to have Wiehahn with me. He is the talent acquisition specialist for CrossBoundary. He's global recruitment. So, Wiehahn, thanks for joining us. Really glad to have you with us. Maybe to start off with, you can tell us a little bit about CrossBoundary.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much, Lindy. Really excited to be speaking with you today. You were there very early in my career when we both worked at AltGen, so it's just really cool to be back in touch and doing something new. Being able to discuss such exciting topics. I think I've looked forward to this now for a while, so really happy to be here. Yeah, CrossBoundary is a really amazing company. To give quite a quick overview of what we do, we have a group of companies. The one division is very focused on advisory work, where we are in all of the emerging markets globally, and we offer boots on the ground investment advisory support for all kinds of different investors who want to achieve goals in these emerging markets. And we bridge that gap between the developed market financing and the developing or the emerging market impact that we want to create. It's mainly transactional due diligence, but also market analysis, and we've answered some really interesting questions there and super excited about the work and the impact that we've created. We also then have a couple of investment platforms, two of them that are focused on renewable energy. The one is more focused on access, and hence the name CrossBoundary Access, focused on mini grids and microgrids for communities. And CrossBoundary Energy is a independent power producer, more focused on private clients, particularly in the mining and the telecom sector. And then we also have Natural Capital, which focuses on nature-based solutions and that financing. They working on some really interesting funding at the moment while doing some advisory work. There's CrossBoundary Real Estate, which focuses on affordable student housing. There's Dow Ventures, our VC arm, that does more of the early stage investing. So yeah, really amazingly interesting company. I think there's a really good kind of impact of, or a collision of, both like brilliance while doing meaningful work. What I've really enjoyed just personally about the company are the people. I think this kind of work where your work has a tangible impact for so many people tends to also attract people who care about a lot of the really important stuff in life. So I've really enjoyed working at the company, both from kind of a professional and personal perspective. Feel very lucky to work here. So yeah, that's CrossBoundary, and a little bit of how I fit in there as well.
That's amazing, Wiehahn. I mean, it's pretty much sounds like there's nothing CrossBoundary doesn't do, which is because you're also recruiting globally, so you've probably mastered a plethora of skills and knowledge across all the different functions and activities. But Wiehahn, I mean, you mentioned we worked together quite a few years ago, and I always think your story is quite interesting. I mean, you came out of university bright-eyed and bushy-tailed with a law degree. So tell us how you got into talent acquisition, and yeah, give us a bit of context there.
Yeah, so I studied law. I'm the fourth brother in my family, so I think I've always had to argue for what I want. So maybe that's what attracted me to law initially. I also watched this series called Boston Legal, and those kind of closing arguments. Alan Shaw, Denny Crane, the closing arguments they used to make, and I don't know, there was something really attractive to me about that. And then there was this one particular subject in my law degree called the law of civil procedure, which is just all of the really like procedural technical stuff. And I think that was my first indication that maybe what I'm more interested in is the people side of things, and what makes people think, and how they are motivated to do things, as opposed to the more technicality, the technical aspects of the law. So luckily my law degree also included subjects like philosophy and psychology, which really helped me to crystallize this interest I had in people and how things work. And then recruitment almost caught me a little bit as a, that was the first way I saw where I could use this combination of skills to do something meaningful, have a career for myself as well.
Mm.
And then very luckily joined Altered, which was, as you say, like had no idea what I was doing at the time, and I learned so much there. Like I'll never forget Sean taking us to the wind farms themselves, and like that was really cool learning. So I was always be super appreciative of that time there. But I've always also wanted to just see a little bit more around like why the decisions are made, and to see behind the curtain a little bit that's there when you are an external agent. So at CrossBoundary, I've really actually found that learning how things work and getting more of a view of these things I'm so passionate about from people I respect. So that's been a really cool next step in the journey.
Well, it's great that you've been able to, apply the knowledge from your legal degree, and then also that you've sort of had this, both look through both lenses of recruitment, external and internal.
Hmm.
One of the things, I want to chat to you about was CrossBoundary has amazing reviews on Glassdoor. So
Mm-hmm.
95% of past employees would recommend working at CrossBoundary to a friend. And the company gets an overall rating of 4.5 stars out of 5 stars, which is stellar. What do you think, the key focus areas are to achieve such positive reviews? And I suppose on the flip side of it is, what do you think that companies should be addressing early on to nip bad reviews in the bud? Once they're online, it's hell of a hard to get it off.
Mm.
Your thoughts around that?
Yeah, that's really, firstly, thanks so much. And that's, like the product of a lot of hard work and you know, um, sort of passion from brilliant people. And I think, if I was to speak about the reasons why or some of the things I think has been key in achieving, the happiness of people that work here, we have very clear culture. We have 10 virtues that we use to guide us. We have values that we keep in mind when we act. And I think this kind of clarity around what we care about is super helpful. And if you send a consistent message, like culture can't be something that leadership says or, that a policy says. It needs to be everywhere.
Yeah.
From small conversations to big decisions. So the clarity around the culture, I think, is a really important part of why people are happy here. And I think the impact of the work they do is also something that I think makes the cross boundary journey something that people reflect on so positively. Recently one of my colleagues for her birthday went and had like an event at one of the schools that her work helped open, and I just that stands out in my mind as a really cool example of like kind of the culmination of how your professional and your personal both can have meaning to you. And I think that's something that I'm always so excited to be able to offer people. I do a lot of interviews, and I hear a consistent message of people saying that I spend more time at work these days than ever before, and I want that to not just reflect in a salary or in a
Yeah.
kind of monetary way, but in a really impactful way. I want to be able to point to things that my work has helped create, and I think it's that meaning behind the work that also leaves people with a positive impression. Yeah,
They
I
don't
think
work
those
in
are.
isolation.
Yeah, they don't work in isolation. Look, it's interesting. We are so distributed across all kinds of different markets and different sizes of office, but we have some really cool steps that we take to ensure that people stay connected with one another, from kind of asynchronous forums to more structured meetings and everything. So again, I don't think that kind of connection is something that really exists within a policy, but more as a culmination of people that are aligned. And I think that is what we do really well, is that people are very aligned and mission driven that work here.
Yeah. And it's nice to see that, that culture is obviously lived and not just communicated, but what impact culture can have on an organization, which is amazing. And
Mm.
then, Vian, one of the other things I want to chat to you about is
Mm.
AI has changed the way job seekers are able to apply to jobs. Now they're able to apply to them in the volumes, which at the same time, while they're doing this, they're able to sound authentic and unique in every application, which makes it hell of a hard for the recruiters on the other end. But I mean, how
Hmm.
have you managed to cut through the fluff while still keeping a pulse on the top talent? What are your strategies there and advice?
Yeah, the whole question behind AI is a really interesting one because we are still figuring out what is the kind of appropriate use for it, right? It reminds me of, you know, I remember when I did my maths at high school. My dad had a bad view on my calculator. He wanted me to be able to calculate these things in my mind. That has just become part of our lives. No one sees a calculator as a crutch or anything right now. And if it's made you able to calculate things you couldn't, then what's the problem? But AI feels so powerful that it feels like we need to have more of a dedicated view or an intentional view on when it's appropriate to use. So, from our perspective, I think first step is to just be very clear about your expectations as a company. If you don't make it clear that certain responses are not to be given by AI, you can't expect candidates to follow those instructions. And again, these days there is no appropriate usage that we've defined just yet. So being really clear about your expectations, I think, helps. Something along the lines of in the application, have a tick box that says that the responses weren't given with the use of generative AI or something. Secondly, I think so like process tracing questions are also helpful. So I think something to note as a employer and an employee is that if you run a really good process and you are screening and you're being diligent, AI usage shouldn't give someone an advantage that they can't apply in their day-to-day work anyway. So whether that's case studies that are done live, or whether it's you know checking certain same qualities at different steps in different ways to see if there's consistency. There's different ways, but I think at the end of the day, if you use AI in a way that supplements you, then it's up to the person to determine if they can be consistent in that delivery as well,
Yeah.
because there is a stage where obviously things will become more clear. I think like to expand a little bit on the candidate side, when I'm going through CVs and applications and questions and everything, right, I screen for specificity and personal causality, like what
Yeah.
you did, how you decided, what changed because of you. Like if a response reaches a level of being generic, that it lacks context, tension, measurable outcomes, it becomes boilerplate or standardized. And
Yeah.
that's one thing like, someone should try to avoid. And then I think a second thing for people to be aware of as candidates, that if you are applying to a role, particularly one that's competitive, your CV is not that different to another person, where even if you give AI all kinds of unique information, what it
Yes.
tends to produce is similar. So if I'm going through CV number 600 for a position, even if in isolation your response that AI has generated for you looks really unique, um,
Yeah.
the repetition becomes super clear. And then once again,
Of course.
if you are screening for specificity and causality and all these things, that it's not like an immediate no, or something really bad, but I do think it's a missed opportunity to distinguish yourself.
Yeah. And what would you say a candidate should be doing to distinguish themselves in, say, the case of a CV?
In the case of a CV, how to distinguish yourself? Okay, so I think the context matters a little bit. And at the end of the day, you have to almost do a decision tree where you have to think, okay, what if a person just looks at my CV for 10 seconds? What are the first things that they want to see? What do they then maybe want to see if they have, a 5-minute review of the CV? What if they have 20 minutes to review, because none of those times are referencing like reality, but it does work the way that, the larger the funnel or the stage of a process or so, the quicker decisions are made. And you want your CV to be strong in each of those phases. So
Yes.
you want to start off with a summary, or the thing at the top of the page that just really crystallizes who you are and can be digested in seconds. You want it
Yes.
to be really quick. You want the page where you are landing, or the person who reviews it, the first thing they see, you want it to be everything that distinguishes you as a candidate. And
Yeah.
for some people, that's, amazing MBAs and qualifications and whatnot. For other people, it's, the experience, a project, a transaction. It can be anything.
Mm.
But make that the very first thing that someone can digest. And
Yes.
then you can always expand on more later on, especially if you have a one page that kind of summarizes everything and then more detail later on. I would liken it to, the back of the book where you're getting enough information to get you excited and you're getting the main kind of snippets, the genre, whatnot, and you can always page through if that captures you. So that would be a couple of practical things on a CV. And I think again here, AI also super helpful. But again, think about this thing of distinguishing yourself in a way. And even if AI has made you a unique CV, it could have made the same unique CV for 100 other people.
Yeah, exactly. And it's pulling from the same, I suppose, source at the end of the day, or whatever the hierarchy is of a of an.
Yes, exactly. And look, like if you're smart, then you feed it the job description, right? And you ask it to, write a summary that speaks to it in a way. But
Yeah.
even that then, because everyone's feeding the same job description, it becomes really similar too. So yeah.
Yeah. And people, I suppose, also need to remember, the only person that really knows you is you. So as much as AI
Yeah.
can help, you have you have the real information sitting in your head. The On the other
Yeah.
side, the flip question, I suppose, I mean, you've covered a lot of it, but for
Hmm.
climate change players looking to adopt AI in their recruitment processes and strategy, are there any quick tips that they should lose quickly, or be aware of using AI, risks around it, or any sort of
Hmm.
insights there?
Hmm. Yeah. Look, there's amazing tools that can be used with AI when it comes to hiring. Um, and I don't mean, outsourcing the difficult stuff like, getting AI to screen your CVs or application questions or so. I still feel like that requires, a personal review. And especially, if we are expecting people to, bring their unique selves, I think at most scales, it makes sense to also have someone, a person review that too. So I think, that's already one thing. However, especially with the new AI agents, you can set up workflows that take care of a lot of your hiring. You can get it to create certain Boolean searches. For those who maybe don't know, like a Boolean search is just the logic, almost like calculus or maths that you use to search through LinkedIn, as an example, like or any database, but in this case, LinkedIn. So if you load a job description to this agent, it will. You can also upload your meeting notes that you had with the hiring manager and all kinds of things. Or the more information, the better. It can suggest different Boolean searches, that relate to industry,
Yeah.
qualification, different companies, and you could then definitely, on a very light touch basis, do a lot of the heavy lift that goes into hiring. So definitely look into those agents and see how you can automate some of your processes.
Yeah. And
And
I
then,
think that's
yeah,
a great point on the processes, because AI is great with processes where it's defined, but also be mindful that AI doesn't, it works off information that's available online. So it doesn't necessarily have the intel on what's happening in Africa where that information isn't publicly available, or, maybe even the cultural nuances of it.
yeah, no, exactly. And I think, like to speak to, like technology in general, and it's almost the similar advice I, would give to a candidate in, use AI to maybe structure, but then personalize. In the same way, I think what AI can do really well is to give you a basis that you can work off. So if you take a structured hiring approach and you have competency frameworks that you align on ahead of time, and you have evaluation matrices and interview questions that are against each of those and such. It can be really helpful in getting you set up with a structure that you can then iterate with a hiring team or so. So it can really also help you to align on, what would make a person really great in the role. Uh, And what also is super helpful about that is, let's say something goes wrong, or let's say something goes very right. If you've used this structured approach that AI can help you to get the foundation for, you can repeat certain actions, you can avoid repeating certain actions. And I think climate is growing so much, and we have to be so lean while we are growing. I
Yeah.
think companies who also treat their hiring data as something to build on, I think will also just put them in a much better position to be successful.
Yeah, that's amazing. Speaking of hiring data and using it strategically, what do you think companies should be measuring? What should the KPIs around recruitment be for companies that are scaling? What do you think the real tangible metrics should be?
Yeah, this is something I'm really passionate about because I think the closer your OKR or KPI is in the hiring team to a larger organizational goal, the more your hiring team will be able to act strategically and as real partners, as opposed to folks who just execute and are more administrative. I think the general theme would be to make things as much outcomes focused as possible, especially given that I'm not sure if it's something that rolls over from like external recruitment or something, right? But there can be quite like a input driven model when it comes to hiring. Like how many candidates did we
Mm,
phone? How many did we, interview? How many did we did? How many did, I think it's much more helpful to look at outcomes. And I think a couple of metrics is like, it's hard to do someone's start date, for example, because notice periods then tend to sometimes skew your data. So there
yeah,
it becomes difficult to measure outcomes specifically, but you can measure if you, for example, make one of the measurables the difference between when the hiring team said the ideal start date is versus when the offer was made. If you could get like an offer made by date that you agree on ahead of time, then
yeah,
it gives your hiring team a license to take ownership of a process. Because
yes,
I think hiring is tough for people because it's one of those things that if you get to hire in your team, it normally means you're already stretched. You've justified an addition, an expansion, or whatever. It normally means someone is already stretched. Now you're telling them you're going to get more work before it gets any better, right? So people can
yeah,
sometimes have not like a natural motivation to get super stuck into to hiring. So having a person who is absolutely dedicated to hiring be the one who has an OKR measurable to deliver at a certain pace, I think helps a lot to keep at a good pace. And
yeah,
then in terms of like the quality of your hire, not the speed, again, focus on an outcome. However you measure the quality of people at your company, use that metric to feed data into your team. Um, your hiring team to show like how good are the quality of their hires, because once again that will incentivize the right kind of behaviors at the setup of the evaluation matrix and the
yeah,
setup of the job description. Like, if you are actually measured by how well someone does in their role and not just if they made their probation or
yeah,
kind of thing, I think it also makes a really big difference. So super outcomes focused, make the hiring team, a core part of your team and not just, people who execute on a need, but rather
yes,
someone that you can think with. And then I do also think that, a part of hiring is de-risking or it's one of those things where people invest a ton of time into, and there's nothing worse than reaching, kind of a final stage with a candidate, or, even when you are in a final stage with a company and things don't work out for whatever reason. Maybe the offer is much lower than you expected as a candidate, or, maybe you find out the candidate has a whatever, like an extremely long notice period and you need the person now. Measuring some sort of offer acceptance rate is also, I think, something useful because, again, it forces your team to take these practical things into account and to align on them
yeah,
before people spend so much of their precious time on something that actually never had the potential to work out. Things happen, but having some sort of offer acceptance rate measured, I think, is also a good metric.
Yeah, if you're going to fail, fail fast. And Wiehahn, I just want to also sort of inquire or talk to you a little bit about, I mean, you play a pivotal role in translating the technical needs and softer needs of a diverse group of leaders. The technical needs generally are quite easy to assess, but can you tell me a bit about, where you see the soft skills gaps lying in the future? Because also, technology is advancing, so what we think we need now from a technical standpoint might change, but the soft skills never do. So, yeah, tell us a bit about that.
Sure. It's also interesting, right? It feels with recruitment or hiring that you're always going to want more information about a person before you have to make such a big commitment. It really is an interesting situation where you're committing to this, long term. Some people spend decades at companies, right? And you made that decision based off of often hours of engagement, right? So both ways, I think, it's always going to be a limited data situation that you need to make a decision on. However, I think that there's a couple of ways in which, the harder skills can be tests. There's assessments and things, but there seems to be more of a gray area when it comes to softer skills. But I do think that if you align well initially, especially if you take the structured approach, right? If you, for example, say that, I don't know, let me use an example like, almost want to say like humor or something, like an irrelevant example, but let's just say discipline. Let's say discipline, right? Is something that you want to, you feel like that is an absolute requirement for this position, for someone to do well in this role. They have to have this kind of characteristic. And a lot of evidence and studies have shown like the best indicator for future behaviors is past behaviors. So if you ask people questions that are aimed at, directly getting to the specific characteristic that you've identified ahead of time, it's very different to how sometimes people treat these softer skills, almost when they will say to you something along the lines of, I just need to have dinner with them, or, if I just get to see kind of the fire in their eyes, I'll know immediately, that kind of thing. So, being structured around these things that can feel vague is really important. And the way that you are structured about them is that you make them part of the criteria that need to be met to be successful in the role. You give them a weighting, and you ask questions that specifically aim to give you a view on these characteristics that you've identified. Because I've definitely found that softer skills play just as much of a role in someone's success and potential not success in their positions.
That's awesome. So everyone, that's a wrap for part 1 of this episode. Stay tuned for episode 2, where Wiehahn shares how to measure what really matters in hiring, from recruitment KPIs to culture fit, and the secrets top talent looks for when choosing their next role. We're always open to our listeners' feedback and ideas, so drop me a DM on LinkedIn or feel free to leave a comment and review. Thanks, guys. See you on the next episode.